Today we're going to learn Eruvin Daf Samach Gimel. Today's daf is dedicated to Ariella Radwin. Happy birthday, Ariella, the Talmud scholar of the Radwin family. We're so proud of your commitment to study the Daf Yomi and to share your love of Torah and learning in our house. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to start at the very top of Samach Gimel. We have a day mostly of, it's kind of agadatot, okay, stories and situations of rabbis. We started this topic of that one is not allowed to teach a halacha in front of one's rabbi, which we discussed already last time, is a little bit of a complicated halacha because it negates our both modern concept and the concept that existed back in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu of there being a hierarchy, and you don't always go to the top guy for every question. That's not a good business model. And yet, however, there's an important principle here, which the rabbis think is crucial, which is kavod harav, that you have to give the proper respect to the rabbi. And if someone teaches a halacha when their rabbi's there, it's showing lack of respect. And then we had a debate, a bit of a question, what kind of halacha? And they said, even a simple, obvious halacha, we're going to consider that one can't teach in front of the rabbi. Obviously, if the rabbi says, I don't mind, then of course this is all allowed. Because when it comes to respect, although the truth is, I shouldn't say obviously, there's a whole debate about whether, let's say a parent can be mochel on their kavod. They could say, it's fine, you could sit in my chair or whatever it might be. They can say it's okay. A Rav, it's a little bit more complicated because a Rav is a representative of God. And it's basically a lack of respect toward God. So there's a debate here. We'll see soon that some people talk about it. Certainly in certain circumstances, there were cases where the rabbis were lenient about this and said, we don't care, you could do this. And customs developed as a result. But it's a bit of a question here. Again, I'm putting this out there. Often you see sugyot which are trying to talk about a certain concept, and they make it so important that it doesn't really talk about the other aspects of this. What about the fact that this goes against what would be a good structure for a Beit Midrash? And if they ask the big rabbi all the questions, it's not going to be a very feasible system. But in any case, we're going to get moving on it. So the last line, just to go back to the very last line of Samach Bet, it said that Lo Ori of Rav Chisda, our Rav Chisda Ore B'Kafre B'Shnei de Rav Huna. Even though he didn't teach halacha b'fnei Rav Huna, when he was in the city of Kafri, he did. And now we're going to talk about all different reasons as to why, when one is allowed to do this. And Tosfot says that it's because, and this, what's interesting about our sugya also is that you get to see who learned by who was on the same level, who was the same generation, or maybe awful, who was the rabbi of who. And some of these books where they discuss this and conclude who learned by who, some of their proofs come from our daf, because you can see from our daf the situation. And Tosfot basically says that Rav Chisda was what we call a Talmid Chaver of Rav Huna. It means he was a little bit below him, but he was also kind of a colleague. And because he was a colleague, when you're a colleague, this fact that you can teach it in a different city is only if you're a colleague, what we call a Talmid Chaver, which is going to come up soon, but not if you're actually really a student. Okay, so we're going to continue on with that. Rav Hamnuna Ore Becharta de Argaz, that's the name of a city. B'Shnei de Rav Chisda. In the years of Rav Chisda, when Rav Chisda was around, he taught again in a different city. And the assumption is also he was a Talmid Chaver of Rav Chisda. Ravina Sar Sakina Bebavel. Ravina would check his own, he checked his own shchita knife in Bavel. Now, shchita knife is a whole thing, which is you're supposed to check your shchita knife to make sure it has no nicks in it. If it has a nick in it, what might happen? When you slaughter the animal, you might end up, you're supposed to slaughter the esophagus and the trachea. And as you're slaughtering it, you might nick it first. You'll cause the animal to be what we call a treifa, which is that the animal is sick and about to die. And only after do you do the shchita. The shchita really has to happen all at once. You kind of kill the animal while you're shechting it. But if it has a nick, you might actually injure the animal first before you finish the shechita. So they would check their knives, but a minhag developed that they would all send their knives to their rabbi to check. And Ravina checked his own knife. So, or he checked knives of other people even, okay, not his own. We'll see his own is something else. Okay, we're going to get to that later. But he checked the knives in Bavel. Amar le Rav Ashi, my tama avid marhachi. So Rav Ashi says to him, why are you doing that? I'm here. I'm the one in charge. Amar le v'ha Rav Hamnuna ore b'charti daragaz b'shnei de Rav Chisda. But look at Rav Hamnuna. He was a Talmid Chaver of Rav Chisda. I'm a Talmid Chaver of you. I'm not a whole level below you. I'm maybe a little bit below you, but I'm also a colleague of yours. And in fact, if you know this, Ravina and Rav Ashi are considered, it says in the Gemara, Ravina and Rav Ashi sof hora'ah. That means They're the ones who kind of finalized the Talmud and they worked on editing it. They were basically colleagues. So he says, look, if he did it, I can do it. Amar le, lav ori itmar. No, it says he didn't teach halacha bifnei Rav Chisda. So answers him Ravina, Amar le, itmar ori ve'itmar lo ori. It was said he taught, it was said he didn't teach. How so? Bishnei de Rav Huna Rabbe hudelo ori. When his teacher Rav Huna was alive, then he didn't teach. But ori bishnei de Rav Chisda, de tamid chaver dilei hava. And here you see it, what I told you from the end of yesterday's daf. It says it, I'm sorry. Oh no, this is something else. This is Rav Hamnuna from the beginning of the daf. So here he basically says he was a tamid chaver of Rav Chisda, not of Rav Huna. Rav Huna, he really had to have, couldn't teach halacha, but Rav Chisda was a tamid chaver, and that's why he did it. And he's basically saying, "Va'ana nami tamid chaver demar ana." And my relationship to you is that we're colleagues, and therefore I can check the knives. Again, in a different city. Okay, if you're tamid chaver in the city of the rabbi, or maybe again, we're going to see whether there's a distinction in front of his face or not in front of his face, right? Where we draw the line here. Amar Rava. Now, Rava, if we're staying on this, checking the shechita knife thing. Oh, so by the way, the shechita knife is a good example. I wanted to mention this, doesn't say this inside, but it's a good example of where it used to be the custom was to show it to the rabbi. It's no longer the custom to show the shechita knife every time to the rabbi, because the rabbis, again, were mochel on their kavod. They said, you don't need to do this anymore. So once they didn't care anymore, then it already, became allowed. So Amar Rava. But again, we're still talking in a time when they needed to check with the rabbi. He says, if you're a Talmid Chacham, you're a student, you know what you're doing, you can check the knife for yourself. Okay, again, what does it mean, laholot halacha? To teach somebody else or to do something for somebody else. But if you're doing it for yourself, that's not a problem. You don't have to start checking with the rabbi. You could check your own knife. So now we're going to have a story. Ravina ikla lemechoza. He got to mechoza. Aite ushbezinche sakina. So the person, the innkeeper, who was basically feeding him, that he was staying in the inn. He was paying money to stay in the inn, and the innkeeper was feeding him. So the innkeeper shows him the knife. Right? He takes his knife, and he shows him. Amar le zil amte le Rava. So Ravina says, you have to show the knife to Rava. He's my rabbi. Amar le lo savar mar hada amaravet sorvim rabban chazeh la'afshe. But wait, this meat is for you. And don't you agree with Rava? And it's Rava himself. You want to send it to Rava, but Rava himself says you don't need to check the knife if it's for your own sake. Amar le ana mizban zvina. I'm purchasing this from you. So really, it's for your sake. It's not for my sake. It's true, I'm going to eventually benefit from this meat, but you're shefting it for your own sake because I paid you money for the meat. So it's really for yourself and not for me, and therefore I can't do it. Okay, moving on. I'm skipping the simanim. Okay, these are simanim for the rabbis that come up in the continuation. Rabbi Elazar ben Hagronia. We're now going to have a story. It should be Acha, which is going to confuse you. There's going to be 3 Rav Achas in this story, so just pay attention to which is which. So we have 2 rabbis, Rabbi Elazar ben Hagronia and Rabbi Acha bar Tachlifa. Iklu lebei Rav Acha berei de Rav Ika. They come to the house of Rav Acha berei de Rav Ika. Be'atre de Rav Acha bar Yaakov. But they all lived in the city of, or the house, it doesn't really matter where they lived, but Rav Acha berei de Rav Ika, whose house they went to, lived in the city of Rav Acha bar Yaakov, who was a big Talmid Chacham of their generation, which is going to be the last line of this sugya. It's going to tell you he was mufla, which means he was way beyond everybody else. It's not exactly sure what it means, but muflag always means stands aside. He stands by himself. By Rav Acha berei de Rav Ika, l'mea balu igla tilta. He wanted to prepare for them in igla meshuleshet. Okay, there's always different interpretations. We have this all over the Gemara. It's some sort of very a better, like the good cut of the egel. Okay, either it's the one who was born third, or he was in its 3rd year, or it was egel meshuleshet. It's the part, a third of it, the best part of the meat. It's a bunch of different interpretations. In any case, he wanted to prepare them a nice piece of meat. So they brought the sakin, and he showed it to them to check. Amar lahu Rav Acha bar Tachlifa, lo lechush le'saba. Don't we have to worry about Saba, about Rav Acha bar Yaakov? In other words, we can't check this knife without checking with Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Amar lahu Rabbi Elazar mehagonia, hachi amar Rava. So Rabbi Elazar mehagonia, we have these 2 rabbis who came to his house. So one says, we can't check this, Rav Acha bar Yaakov's here. The second one says, of course we can check this. Right? So he can check for himself. So of course we could do this. This is for us. We're not paying money. It's not like the previous story. So we can check. Well, what happens in the story? Chaze v'i anish. So they check the knife and they get punished. Okay, who gets punished? Rabbi Lazar Me'agronya. Yanish Rabbi Lazar Me'agronya. He gets punished for making the suggestion and for doing it. So, ha-marava, tzorva meraban chaze l'nafshe. But don't we have that you're allowed to do this? So, Shane Hatam, we're going to have two possible explanations. This is very interesting. Since one of them already mentioned, if the first one hadn't started, it would have been fine. But since he said we should be respectful to Rav Acha bar Yaakov, and then the other one said, no, we don't need to. This is like a good lesson. If you're in a discussion and there's a debate about is it respectful or is it not respectful, it's dangerous. If somebody says it's respectful and then you say, oh, it's not really such an issue, you're really in trouble, because once someone mentions it, then already it's a problem. So now they say that's one option. Maybe he was in a different category than everybody else. A Rav, a regular Rav, yes, but he was, you can do it. But he was way and beyond everybody, and then you really need to show him, okay? And then we should have really shown him. Interestingly, la halacha, they quote both these things, because when you have, this is a good example of, you have two possible answers to rectify a situation that we don't really understand. The question is, are these actually then quoted la halacha, or were they just brought as answers? So people say, in both these situations, you actually can't check the knife. Again, not in our day when we don't care anymore about the respect for rabbis when it comes to shechita, because the rabbis already said we don't care. But if you were, then you'd have to worry about both of these issues. Amar Rava, ulefrushe meisura afilu befanav shapir dami. Sorry. Rava now says another limitation. He says, if someone is doing something wrong and you want to stop them, then even if your rabbi's there, you're allowed to do this. And we'll see why soon. We're going to have a story. Ravina Havayativ Kameh de Rav Ashi. Chazir, now he was in front of Rav Ashi. This isn't like before where he was not in front of him, right? Where he was in a different city. And then we said it was okay. But here he was right in front of him. He saw someone who was tying his donkey to a tree on Shabbat. Now, you're not allowed to use trees on Shabbat. The rabbis instituted, right? We already learned this a bunch of times. Rami Beikali starts screaming at him, stop what you're doing. It's Asar on Shabbat. But the person didn't listen to him. Amarle, he says, I'm excommunicating you, even though Rav Ashi was right there. He could have handled it. Amarle. So Rav Ashi says to him, this is disrespectful to me what you're doing, isn't it? Amarle, okay, this means, right, there's no wisdom, there's no knowledge, there's no advice in front of Hashem, meaning, okay, this is how he understands this verse in Mishlei and Proverbs. Says this means basically there's no, when it's a chilul Hashem, you can do anything even in front of your rabbi. Now this makes a lot of sense, because if you say that respect of your rabbi is respect for God, when there's something that's so disrespectful to God, it overrides the lack of respect for the rabbi. And therefore, when I saw someone being Mechalel Shabbat in public, I had to go out and do something, even though you were here. That was much more important than stopping to give proper respect and waiting for you to do it. No, I had to act immediately. Amarava, bifanav asur v'chayav mita. If you do it and the rabbi's right there and you teach halach in front of your rabbi, you're chayav the death penalty, not in court, but by the hands of God. Shelo b'fanav asur v'ein chayav mita. If he's not there, then it's forbidden, but you don't get the death penalty. So the Gemara says, "V'shelo b'fanav lo." Is that really true? That if you do it not in front of him, you're not obligated the death penalty? V'hatanya. Now we're going to have a bright time. We're going to start off with Nadav and Avihu. I see, Becky, that you wrote in the WhatsApp about in the chat about Nadav and Avihu. They're going to come up right now. And then what's really going to be important for our purposes, though, is the second part of that bright time. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Lo metu b'nei Aharon ad she'oru halacha b'fnei Moshe Rabban. Sons of Aaron, okay, there's always a big question, and there's other sources which list many different possibilities as to what they did wrong, and therefore were obligated death. This Gemara brings only one reason, and the reason is our reason, which is they taught the halacha when Moshe was there, and they could have asked Moshe, and instead they decided a halacha on their own. This, by the way, shows that lahorot halacha, when we compared it to the knife also, it's not just to teach. it's to actually do something, or to do something maybe publicly. Because here they weren't teaching anybody, they were just learning a halacha, and we'll see what halacha they derived, which was actually a mistake. We're going to see they made a mistake in their halacha. The mistake doesn't bother us. It's the fact that they didn't ask Moshe what the halacha was, and they came up with it on their own. So what happened? So he says, my darish, what did they think? So when it says they brought a fire to the altar, what was the problem? Amru, they said like this. Even though we know that God is supposed to bring the fire down, it's better if we bring it ourselves. This is, you could say, right? This is like hishtad, don't expect everything's going to come down from the heavens. You should make your own effort. So they said, it's true, it's going to come down from the heavens, but maybe we also should be doing our part and bringing the fire also. I'm not going to get into this, but there's a whole big debate about where they brought this fire, because they were bringing the incense. The incense is usually done inside the heichal. Some people say they actually went into the Kodesh Kodeshim. Some people say they actually were bringing it on the outer altar. Because why? Because what did they do? There were two marachot. We'll get to this all later, but there were, if you know, there's two places where there was a fire on the Mizbeach. One was the big one where they would do all the sacrifices, and the other one was the small one. They would take the fire from there inside. They never lit a fire inside the heichal. So that's why some people say this actually happened on the outer altar and not the one that was inside. The outer altar was for the sacrifices, and the inner one was for the incense burning. So there's a whole debate here. I'm not going to get into the whole debate, but I'll just, I'll mention it so you know it's out there. So now, remember, what happens to Bnei Aaron? They get killed for this, okay? So why did they get killed? So they said, they darsha the halacha, and they made a mistake, okay? The mistake doesn't bother us. The issue is that they taught it on their own without asking Moshe when Moshe was there. Could have asked Moshe. The Braita continues, and this is the part that's important for our purposes, because why are we bringing this? We're bringing this to show, remember where we start? Is it true that if you're not in front of your rabbi and you teach halacha, you're not obligated to the death penalty? Here we're going to see a story. Talmid echad hayalo leRabbi Eliezer, she'oreh halacha b'fanav. He taught halacha in front of Rabbi Eliezer. Amar Rabbi Eliezer li'ima shalom ishto. He said to his wife, Ima Shalom, Tameh ani im yotzi zeh shnato. I don't think this person's going to live out the year. V'lo hotzi shnato, and in fact, he didn't. Amra lo navi ata. She says, wow, you're a prophet. Amar la lo navi anochi v'lo ben navi anochi. I'm not the prophet. I'm not the son of a prophet. Ela kach mekublani, but I do know halacha. Kol amoreh halacha b'fnei rabo chayav mita. Anyone who teaches in front of his rabbi is obligated. Again, this doesn't really seem to contradict, because this is also bifnei rabo. We're trying to find something shelo bifnei rabo. But about this Braita, it was said, Va'amar Rabba bar bar Chan amar Rabbi Yochanan, Oto Talmid Yehuda ben Guria Shmo. His name was Yehuda ben Guria. V'haya rachok mimenu shalosh parsot. And he was 3 parsaot distance, which is 12 mil, which is a very long distance. This is what we've said many times, that those who think that Tchumen is only D'Rabbanan, of those people, some of them think that on a Torah level, it's your bet meal. There is Tchumen on a Torah level. It's just a much larger distance than 2,000 cubits. In any case, they say he was far away from him. So now they say, so there's our question. Even though it says he was Bifanav, they understand he wasn't really Bifanav. He was 3 parsaot distance, 3 parasangs it's called. Okay, and that was pretty far. And here you see he got killed. So the Gemara says, no, Bifanav hava. No, he really was in front of him. So they say, what do you mean? We just said, it says he was 3 parasangs away. So then he says, wait a minute. According to you, the fact that it says he was 3 parasangs means he was far away. Well, if that's the case, Shmo v'shem aviv lama. Why did he bother telling us? Why did Rabbi bar bar Chana tell us in Rabbi Yochanan that his name was Yehuda ben Guria, right? That his name was Yehuda. His father was Guria. Why are those details important? So he says, Ela shalot tomar mashal haya. Those details are important to tell you that this was a real person and it was a real situation. Right? Well, often we see these stories, we don't really know, are they real or are they not? When you put a name to something, and not only a name, he now wants to go so far as to say, and a place. We're saying it's this guy, Yehuda ben Guria, who lived 3 parasangs distance from Rabbi Eliezer. It doesn't mean that when he taught the halacha, he was 3 parasangs from him. It's just describing who he is and where he lives so that you know he was a real person and this wasn't just a some story. Okay. Now we're going to see all sorts of other punishments. Until now we saw you're supposed to get death by the hands of God. Now we're going to see it doesn't actually say you're going to get bitten by a snake, but you're you should get bitten by a snake. Shenema, Payan, Eliu ben Brachel Abuzi. This is one of in the characters who show up in Eov. Vayomer, Sa'ir ani liyamim. He says, I'm young in days, meaning, and then it says, and you're old, and who am I to speak in front of you? Al kain zachalti, and therefore, what it really means in the pshat is, I'm not going to speak. Okay, but they take this word zachalti, and they say, where else does this appear? In Parshat HaAzinu, it describes all the bad things that are going to happen to the Jewish people over history, and it says, Uchtiv im chamat zochale afar. Okay, it says these things are going to happen to you with the anger of the zochale afar, with those who crawl on the ground, meaning the snakes. So they basically say, there it says zachalti. What he means to say is, if I were to speak up, I would get bitten by the zochalim, by those who crawl, and that curse that came up in Hazinu would happen to me. This is like an associative word connection. Ze'eri Amar Rabbi Chanina, he said the name of Rabbi Chanina, Nikra Chote. Okay, you're considered a sinner if you do this. Shnei Amar, how do we know this? It says in, I believe this is Tehillim, in Tehillim, Bilibit safanti imratecha leman lo echtalecha. Okay, what does this mean? The pshat of this, the simple reading is, I kept Bilibit safanti imratecha. All the things that you say, God, I've kept in my heart, and therefore I won't forget the Torah. Leman lo echtava. But what's the drasha? Bilibit safanti imratecha. Really, I'm going to keep it inside. I'm not going to speak. Because if I were to speak in the wrong context, meaning I speak in front of my rabbi, what will happen? Right? Lema lo echtalach, so that I don't sin to God. So if you speak in front of your rabbi and you don't keep it in your heart, right, then you will sin. Okay, one of the hardest things in the world is to keep quiet. I don't know if you know this, but it's really difficult. Okay, there's a condition called selective mutism where it often happens in children where they don't talk to certain people, they'll keep silent, and it's an unbelievable thing to see how they could. It takes a lot, they say it takes a lot of determination to be able to do a lot of strength, inner strength, to be able to not speak, right? So here he's saying, I keep it in my heart because if I speak it, I'll sin. Rav Hamnuna Rami, he brings the contradiction between this verse and another verse. It says in Tehillim, as we know, Bilibit safanti imratecha, but it also says in Tehillim, which the assumption is, according to the Gemara, David wrote all of these and they must fit with each other. Bisarti tzedek b'kahal rav. I basically spoke out loud and taught everybody. So how could it be that David was silent and otherwise David was not silent? How do you explain that? Lo kashya. Kam bizman she'ira haya'iri kayam. That was his teacher. When Ira haya'iri was still alive, he was silent. Bilibit safanti. The kam bizman she'ein ira haya'iri kayam. When he wasn't anymore, then David had to fit, go into his shoes, and he had to teach everybody. Amar Rabbi Abba bar Zavda. Okay, now how we're going to, since we heard about Ira Haya'iri, we're now going to hear about him and we're going to learn some halacha, unconnected, but interesting halacha, and very relevant actually. There were matnot kuna. Those are all the gifts you're supposed to give to the kohen. Now, that means my trumot, right? I take my trumot from my produce and I give it to the kohen. Now, I'm allowed to give it to whatever kohen I want. There's no rules about it. Here's the one rule. You can't give them all to one kohen because you're going to bring famine. It makes a lot of sense. If you give all your matnot to one kohen, and imagine everybody does that, and they only give to particular kohanim, the whole idea of giving to the kohanim is that they didn't have their own food, and you need to help support them. And if we only support one person, and why is this super relevant? We don't give matnot kuna anymore, but what do we give? Staka. It's quoted lahalacha based on this Gemara. You should not give all your money to one charity. You need to diversify, because you need to help support different places. Okay, so it's good halacha. Shenemar, how do we know that this brings famine? So we're going to prove it from David HaMelech from the Sefer Shmuel. What does it say? Ira haya kohen leDavid. Okay, how do we know that David gave all his matnot kuna to Ira? That's the first thing, and then we're going to see how do we know he was punished for it, that there was a famine. So Ira was a kohen for David. Says about Ira. So they say, David have a kohen? What do you mean? He was a priest for David, right? The Lekule Amalo, he wasn't a kohen for everybody, right? You're a kohen, you're not a kohen for a particular person. Right? Therefore, it must mean he was to David because David gave him all of his gifts. Uktiv batre, and then it says, Vayirav b'mei David. After that was quoted, it then says, and there was a famine in the days of David. So you see the two are interconnected. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Moridin otomi gdulato, another thing that happens to you, or again, these are either different options, but again, this is a midah keneged midah. If you're horeh halacha b'fnei rabo, it's trying to show you're trying to make yourself into somebody great. Well, you're going to be taken down from your greatness. Shene'amar, Vayomer Elazar Kohen. Interestingly, 3 out of Aaron's sons are basically punished because of moreh halacha b'fnei rabo. He also did it. It's just interesting if you think about it. That was really the first real manhigut there was with Moshe. You have Korach, where people were upset about his manhigut. Then even they tried to show that the sons of Aharon even were having issues with Moshe's leadership. So it says, Vayomer Elazar Kohen el Anshe Tzava. This is in Bamidbar, chapter 31. It says, he says to the Anshe Tzava, people of this is when they had the battle with the Midyanim. And then it says, Habaim LaMilchama, okay, those that are coming to fight. Zot chukat haTorah asher tziva Hashem et Moshe. It says, these are the laws that God commanded Moshe. And you would think that's proper according of respect to Moshe. But what's the problem? Why did he speak up and not Moshe? Okay, I think what they're also trying to get at is you don't really see him speaking to people in general. Why all of a sudden now is he speaking? And they basically say this shows it was a mistake that he did. He shouldn't have done this. Even though he said to my uncle Moshe, was commanded, not me, but I'm telling you, even so, how do we know he was punished? This is very interesting. Dichtiv. It says about to Yoshua. Moshe tells Yoshua, when you become the leader, he says, V'lifnei Elazar Kohen Yamod, you're going to stand before Elazar Kohen. And then it says, V'sha'alo ba'urim v'tumim. Okay, I'm trying to find the exact words. Lifnei Elazar Kohen Yamod, V'sha'alo b'mishpat ha'urim lifnei Hashem, al piv yetzeu v'al piv yavo, hu v'chol b'nei Yisrael. Okay, in other words, there's going to come a time you're going to stand before Elazar Kohen. He's going to, you're not going to make all the decisions. You're going to go to him. He's going to check with the urim v'tumim. Right, that was this thing that gave answers to people. And then you'll decide to go out to war based on it. However, okay, now this is a little, let's just assume right now, and then I'll tell you the problem with this. We're going to see what it says. So how was Elazar punished? And Yorad Migdulato, he never reached the level he was supposed to reach. Because it says, V'lo eshkachan de'itzrich leYoshua. It never says that Yoshua went to Elazar to ask about the Urim V'Tumim. Okay, now it's a little bit problematic because we know of 2 situations where Yoshua used the Urim V'Tumim. One was when he came to giving out the Nahala, he did it all by this Goral. And the other, which the Goral is the Urim V'Tumim. And also when Achan took the Shalal and he had to figure out who was the person who took the Shalal, who took the booty in the battle of Jericho, he also goes to the Urim V'Tumim. So some people split this into 2 and say, no, there were 2 things. One is you're going to Amo B'fnei Elazar Kohen. And that's why they didn't even quote the second part of the verse, because that means if you have a halachic issue, you're going to go and ask him a question. And that never happened. The Urim V'Tumim, right, that's something else. Okay, you might also go to Elazar for that, but there were 2 things he was saying. You're going to stand before Elazar. When are you going to stand before him? To ask him some sort of question. And we never see that Yoshua asked Elazar a question. So it must be that he never got to fulfill that role that he was destined for. Okay, that's what they're saying. There's different explanations. Some people say the Urim V'Tumim that he's discussing are ones that not that were commanded by God, like the one of the Nachalah was Al Pi Hashem, like that was already determined. It was supposed to be something comes up and you'll need to ask the Urim V'Tumim, although that happens with Achan, and that's why it's a little bit weak, that interpretation. Okay, so anyway, let's move on. Amar Rabbi Levi. It's, by the way, it's an interesting thing about you going into a job and then you don't really have a purpose, right? It's the worst feeling where you take on this role and then you can't even do anything about it. Okay, so let's move on. Amar Rabbi Levi, kol demotiv milah kamei rabbe azil l'shaol below vlad. Another thing that happens, if you say anything in front of your rabbi, you will go into the depths without having offspring. How do we know this? Shenemar vayan Yoshua benu meshalet Moshe mibchurav vayomer Adoni Moshe klaim. Remember, Yoshua suggests when Eldad and Medad start testifying in the camp, he comes and he says, put them in jail. And then Moshe says, no, we shouldn't, whatever. It's interesting. Even, and this furthers my question that I asked in the beginning of class, which is, you can't even suggest something to your rabbi, right? The Gemara is full of students asking questions to their rabbis and encouraging that kind of thing. So it's very interesting to hear maybe the way he said it, right? It's always, my mother would say, it's your tone of voice, right? It's maybe the way he said it. And it depends, right? How you do things. So how do we know Yoshua was punished? He doesn't have offspring. Nun beno Yoshua beno. Okay. In fact, Yoshua did have girls, it says, but I'm not sure if it actually, I didn't check this, if it says it in the Tanakh, or it's just maybe the Midrash says he had daughters. Might just be the Midrash. Okay, so anyway, whether you say Vlad doesn't include, often most of the commentaries say he did have daughters, he didn't have sons, which means he wasn't fulfilling the mitzvah Priya Rivya, that you need a son and a daughter. So he didn't fully fulfill the mitzvah. Because there it says in Sefer Divrei Yamim, Nun was his son and Yoshua was Nun's son, and it ends right there. So there were no male offspring, right? Usually they don't mention the females there on those lists. Upliga de Rabbi Abba bar Papa. But we're going to see, so okay, we're going to say now that what we just said was that there, as a punishment for being Moreh Halacha B'fnei Rabo, the Yoshua said, Adoni Moshe Klaim, he was punished, he didn't have offspring or sons. So now we're going to say, well, not everybody agrees that that's why he was punished. We're going to see some other reasons. Pliga de Rabbi Abba bar Papa, because Rabbi Abba bar Papa Amal, Dama Rabbi Abba bar Papa, Lo ne'enash Yoshua ela b'shvil shebitelik Yisrael laila echad miPriya Rivya. That's a much more midah keneged midah. He prevented people from sleeping in their beds with their wives, okay? Prevented people from creating more offspring. And that's why he was punished by not having offspring. How so? Well, we're going to have to see this whole story. Shenemar, Vayihi biyot Yoshua b'Yericho. It's a famous story when he's in Yericho and he sees, Vayisayna vayar, I'll read you what doesn't say here in what they don't quote in the Gemara. He sees, Vinei ish omed lenegdo. He sees this person in front of him. V'charbo shlufa biyado, and he has a sword in his hand. Vayelach Yoshua elav vayomer lo halanu atam litzarenu. Are you with us or against us, right? Like, who are you? Vayomer lo, and lo could be lo with a vav or lo with an aleph. There's a bit of a whole commentary about this. Ki ani sar tzava Hashem. I am from the army of God. Okay, I'm an angel. Ata bati. We're going to darshan this phrase. Now I'm coming. Vayipol Yoshua panav artza v'yishtachavu. Right, and then he says, okay, tell me what you want. So anyway, what does it mean? Ata bati. Now I came. So before we even start, I'll just give you a good example. This is when a teacher gets upset at a student. Okay, the student's talking in class. And the teacher doesn't comment, it continues on. And then finally the teacher says, you're punished because you've been talking and talking. And the student's like, you didn't even tell me yesterday. Like, why are you saying I've been talking? You never commented on it before. I kind of thought you weren't noticing, right? And then basically when it builds up, all of a sudden the teacher, or likewise, parent gets a call, the teacher says, the kid hasn't been behaving all semester. And the parent says, why didn't you tell me earlier, right? And, now I came, and why did I come now? Because now it got really bad. Okay, now it hit breaking point. So that's what he's going to say. What is that? Tabati? Amarlo. Emesh, yesterday, and it didn't come yesterday, okay? But yesterday, Bitaltem Tamid Shabein Arbaim. What happened in Yericho? They fought all through the night, and the night is not generally a time for war. So he says, yesterday you were fighting till late in the day, and you didn't end up doing the Korban Tamid Shabein Arbaim, okay? The afternoon sacrifice. V'achshav, and today, Bitaltem Talmud Torah. And now, right, they would war during the day and learn at night. And here you didn't let them go back at night. And therefore, nobody learned Torah. Or you also didn't learn Torah. So Yeshua says to him, Al eza mehem bati. And here's the analogy that I gave before. Amarlo ata bati, right? I came now because this was really bad. Yesterday was, manageable, but this is really bad. And we'll see where they darshan from this in a minute. So anyway, miyad, how do we know that this is what that had to do with Talmud Torah? So they're going to say, because it says it isn't miyad, it's not immediately, but the next time they go out to war with the battle of the Ai, it says there, Vayelech Yoshua balaylahu betocha emek. He says he went in that night into the valley. Now, what does it mean? Why are they telling us this? And what does it mean he went into the valley? They darshan this. Amar Rabbi Yochanan melamed shalach ba'omka shel halacha. Okay, he went down into the depths, into the omek of halacha, meaning he fixed the problem from last time. This time at night, what did he do? He wasn't fighting. He went to learn. Okay, and he fixed what said was wrong. Now, what does this have to do? We were trying to show that he was mevatel from Priya Rivya. Well, what do they say? Ugamiri to call, and we have a tradition. Shekol zman she'aron v'shchina shchoyin shelo b'mkomam. When the aron and the shechina of God, the presence of God, is not in their place. When you go out to war, what did they do? They took the aron with them, which means the aron wasn't in its place. And whenever it's not in its place, asurim b'tashmish hamita. They're forbidden to have sexual relations. So what do you see here? He prevented, by having the war go on at night, he did bring the aron back to its place. He basically caused people not to have children. Because of that, he was punished. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Inya mishmei derav. Okay, what's interesting about him, he's second generation of Amoraim, which makes sense in light of his statement that he's He's after the Churban, but not so far after the destruction, right? Destruction was 70, Tanaim, beginning of Tanaim is 200, so not far into that. He makes this good, important statement from what we just learned. Gadol Talmud Torah yoter mehakravat midin. Okay, you can understand in the light of the Churban why they're saying this. Right? People thought that sacrifices were so central, and they were struggling in that time period to live without sacrifices. And he's trying to say, no. This shows you from the fact that the first night he didn't complain when they canceled the Korban Tamid, but when they weren't learning Torah, that was more important. It's because the Torah has, we usually say davening has replaced sacrifices, but also learning Torah has replaced sacrifice, and that becomes more important. Da Amarle, Atabati, because he said, now I came, right? I came on what was the worst thing, right? Not the previous, okay? Amar Abron Amarav, Kol Hashem B'Kil'ah. So now that we already got on this topic of not allowing a husband and wife to have children, preventing them, so now we say anyone who sleeps in a room where Ish V'Ishto Shvuyim Ba, where there's husband and wife there, and you're basically preventing them from having children by being there. Alava Katuv Omer, and now they quote a verse from Micha, which describes the situation, and then tells all the punishments that are going to come upon the people who do this. You basically chase the women out of their place of pleasure. Okay, so that means you prevented them from having relations with their husbands. But Amar Rabbi Yosef is an interesting one. Afilu be'ishto nida, even if his wife is nida, you can't be there. Where it's forbidden for them to sleep together, to have relations together. Then, even then, you can't be in a room with them. It's still not appropriate. Rava Amar im ishto nida tavo ala bracha. Rava says the opposite. It's all the better. He's ensuring that they keep the law and they don't have relations. So it's better if there's somebody there. But the Gemara interestingly says, and better, right? This sits with us better, Vilohi. That's not true, because who says they need protection from this, right? Ada idna man natre, who's been watching them all this time until you showed up on the scene, right? They're always together in a room by themselves when she's in need. We don't distrust people when it comes to this kind of thing. They don't need people to check up on them. Okay, finally done with this, and not finally, but meaning we're now going to go back to our topic of Eruv Chatzera, right? It's always fun when we have this kind of a digression. Some people like it, some people don't. It's all a matter of taste, but it's good. It kind of keeps things a little bit different. We're now back to Eruv Chatzerot. And I wanted to, before we go back to Eruv Chatzerot, I thought it'd be good to give a little bit of intro. Even though we learned about it in the beginning, it's always good to review things. And I thought the Rambam, always in the Mishnah Torah, he has a very good, clear, organized way of explaining things. So I wanted to go back and read a little bit in the Mishnah Torah. So let me just read and I'll paraphrase a little bit. If there's a lot of people living in one courtyard, okay, they each have their own houses. That's what we're discussing. Theoretically, by Torah law, everyone can carry here freely. Why? Because it's a private space. It's not public. What's public? The shuk, right? The big public thoroughfare. This is not public. And not only that, but even in a mavoi, which has a bunch of courtyards open, by Torah law, you can carry from anywhere you want. And even, he says, in a medina, in a city, that's mukefech choma, gavoa sarat tvachim. If there's a wall around the city that's 10 tvachim tall, by Torah law, you can carry in here. It's a private domain. Okay? However, halacha bet. Midivrei sofrim, asur l'shchenim l'taltel b'rishutei yachid, sheyesh b'chalukah b'diyurim. Once it's sectioned off into different people living there, okay, and this is why they said exactly, okay, this is in Hilchot Eruvin, the first parak, the first chapter, the first halacha. That's where I'm reading, the very beginning of Hilchot Eruvin, which is found in the book of Zmanim. It's all about things that are timely, Shabbat, Eruvin, Psachim, all that. So now, he says, if it's separated into individuals living there, then already we're going to say you have to make an Eruv. Okay? Okay, I'm skipping halacha gimel, I'm moving to halacha dalet. Why? So that people don't get confused and say, just like I can bring to the courtyard, because the courtyard has a bunch of people moving around, or I can move to the mavoi, where there's even more people moving around, maybe I can already take it out to the public domain. And because of that, maybe they'll say, oh, the shvakim, they belong to our city, and that's okay. So to prevent that, we basically said, we're going to make these forbidden until, right? And that's why even if you have a lechi or a korah in your mavoi, and you've done it in that way, you still need food. The food basically is an indicator that we're all one unit. Okay, and that we're Rishudei Yachid of one person. Even remember, we learned Rishudei Yachid to Rishudei Yachid of two people, theoretically, you could carry. But again, they forbade it so that you don't confuse things. So now we're going to start with the story, which we're only going to start today. We're going to have a story of someone. We learned about a non-Jew in the courtyard with Jews. And we said that in order to prevent the Jews from living among non-Jews, they made it very difficult, basically. In other words, we'll just say very simply, they wanted to make it incredibly difficult for Jews to live with non-Jews so that the Jew would choose to find a place with only Jews. But if you remember, Eliezer ben Yaakov in the Mishnah said it's only a gzerah, it's only forbidden that the Jew has to, remember they said that the Jew, non-Jew, has to rent you his space, some sort of fictitious rental, okay, where there was a debate about what kind you needed, but some sort of rental, because they would never in their right mind do that, which means that you're going to be stuck and you won't want to be in a place where you can't even carry out into your courtyard, and therefore you'll end up moving somewhere else or right, figure out some solution. So we're now going to have a story that happened. There was a mavoi in an alley. Davadayar ba Lachman baristak. Lachman baristak, a non-Jew, lived in the courtyard, in the alley. Amrule oger lamashutech. So they said, please rent us your space. Lo oger lahu. He didn't allow it. Okay, so just to remind you, I was about to say this and then I forgot, but according to Rabbi Meir, it doesn't matter how many Jews are living in the courtyard, it's forbidden no matter what. According to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, it's only if 2 Jews are living there, because one Jew would almost never live by himself. Therefore, it's a very uncommon case, and the rabbi don't make ordinances in rare cases. So remember that, that's going to be important here. Here, it's not the case. There's a lot of people living in this court, in the mavoi with the non-Jew. Atu Amr Leila Abai. So they go to Abai. They say, what can we do? Amar Lahu, Zilu Batilu Rishutaichu Lagabe Chad. We already learned that Bitul Rishut is one of the ways the Jews can do it. If one Jew forgets to join the courtyard, he can just say, oh, I give you rights, because he can't join the courtyard on Shabbat already, but he could say, I give you rights to just walk into my house, which he can do. So now he says, everybody do that to one person in the Mavoi. And then it'll be like one person in the Mavoi with the non-Jew, and that already we said, there's no ordinance there. Be like one with Nochri, and that's not forbidden. So Amrle, they said to Abaye, this doesn't make sense. That's because people don't normally live one person with this non-Jew. But we're all living here with him. You can't say this is a rare situation. Not a rare situation. We all live here with him. It's not like there's one person living. Fictitiously, we're going to make it one person living, but we're all really living here. So you can't say that. So Amarlu, the situation where all the Jews living in the alley would all say, we give rights to one person to live and go in our space, that would be very rare situation, which makes this situation a very rare situation, which means that we don't have to make the ordinance in that case. So therefore, it'll be a milta de lo shchicha, right? And therefore, milta de lo shchicha lo gazru be'rabanan. So that's a solution, which sounds kind of okay. And we're going to have some questions on this tomorrow. We'll pick up with this in the next shiur. Not so clear whether this is really okay. And we're going to have more discussions about what they could do in this particular situation. Shavua Tov, Choref Tov, as they say in Israel, day after the Chagim, right? This is the time when, after the Chagim, now everything has to get done, although I guess people could still use Corona as their excuse. Okay, have a great day, everybody.